Throughout Texas history, there have been many missions, presidios, and settlements that are rich with history and have magnificent stories. They were built for a variety of reasons, ranging from military to religious, but none are far more interesting than Los Adayes. Throughout the early decades of Spanish colonization, Spain had claimed much of the Gulf Coast of North America, and its empire expanded from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic. However, the regions east of the Rio Grande were largely ignored by the great power throughout the 17th century. They only began to pay attention to these territories when the French began to establish forts at Biloxi Bay and on the Mississippi River, ending Spain's exclusive control of the Gulf Coast. Spain recognized that the threat of French encroachment on these territories could threaten other Spanish areas in North America, and ordered the reoccupation of Texas as a buffer between New Spain and New France. In 1715, a man by the name of Domingo Romano was appointed commander of a Spanish expedition and was ordered to establish 4 religious missions as well as a presidio to prevent French expansion from Louisiana. They would leave on April 12, 1716, from modern-day Guerrero, Mexico, while the French were building a fort at Natchitoches, having founded the town 2 years earlier. They would reach the east of the territories in late June of 1716 and would push into Louisiana, where they established 2 more missions just west of Natchitoches. However, the latter 2 missions were located in a disputed area. France claimed the Sabine River was the westernmost boundary of French Louisiana, while Spain claimed the Red River was the easternmost boundary of Spanish Texas, leaving an overlap of 45 miles. In June of 1719, as part of the War of the Quadruple Alliance, 7 Frenchmen from Natchitoches took control of the mission of San Miguel de los Adayes from its Spanish defenders, who didn't even know the nations were at war. The French soldiers explained that 100 additional soldiers were en route to the mission, and the Spanish colonists, missionaries, and the remaining soldiers abandoned the area and fled to San Antonio. The French soldiers then planned to move on San Antonio. However, by July 1721, as they were moving to San Antonio, the French force would encounter a Spanish expeditionary force of 500 men under the command of Marquis de San Miguel de Aguayo. The commander of the French force, realizing that he was badly outnumbered and outgunned, agreed to abandon eastern Texas and return to French Louisiana. Aguayo then ordered the building of a new presidio named Nuestra Señora de Pilar de los Adayes, or Los Adayes, located near present-day Robeline, Louisiana. Los Adayes became the easternmost establishment of Spanish Texas. It was built with a thick hexagonal stockade with 3 defensive bulwarks that surrounded the town and its mission. The fort was guarded by a battery of 6 cannons and a garrison of 100 Spanish soldiers. However, this number was reduced to 60 soldiers to lessen the expense of defending the Spanish frontier in North America. It contained 4 soldier barracks, a gunpowder house, an officer's barracks, a ground house, and a chapel. With the new protection of this fort, all 6 of the eastern Texas missions were reopened for resettlement. 8 years later, in 1729, 2 decisions by Spanish authorities further defined the character of Los Adayes. The Viceroy's regulations of that year designated Los Adayes as the capital of Spanish Texas, and because of this, they would add a governor's house to the fort. However, there were complications with the fort's position. Spain had discouraged manufacturing in its colonies and limited trade of Spanish goods to be handled by Spanish merchants and carried on Spanish vessels. Most of the ports, including all of those in Texas, were closed to commercial vessels in hopes of discouraging smugglers. By law, all goods bound for Texas had to be shipped to Veracruz, then transported over the mountains to Mexico City before being sent to Texas. This caused the goods to be very expensive in Texas settlements, and because of the great distance between Los Adayes and the rest of the populated portions of Texas, the settlers in the area turned to the French colonists in neighboring Natchitoches for trade. Food supplies such as corn, beans, and wheat were supplied to the Spanish in significant quantities from this source, and the Spanish recognized the need for this trade, and they constantly relaxed restrictions on commerce in foodstuffs. Though trade in other goods was prohibited, however, illegal trade still continued in spite of these restrictions. It is ironic that Los Adayes, which was established to protect East Texas from the French, found itself dependent upon French trade. French trade items were also an important element in the Native American trade carried on by the inhabitants of Los Adayes. Spanish prohibitions had an effect on the trade with local Native Americans because the Spanish missionaries and colonists had little to offer the natives who were loyal to French traders. The Spanish settlers in the area did not encounter hostile Native Americans, since the local Catalan-speaking peoples were friendly. However, the missionaries were unsuccessful in converting the local people to Catholicism. After many years of frustration in this regard, in 1768 the College of Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe de Zacatecas, which was the sponsor of the missionaries at Los Adayes, recalled the missionaries, and the mission was closed. Aside from the military perspective of the garrison and the religious nature of the mission, a wide diversity of occupants existed at Los Adayes among the civilian populace. It included cattle traders, woodcutters, blacksmiths, and domestic services, and many of the settlers were also involved in the deerskin trade with the Native Americans as well. The worst time for the Adayesans came in the mid-1730s. Crop failures, severe weather, and inadequate supplies from New Spain combined to produce a desperate state of affairs. Although the settlers did not experience such severe circumstances again, life at Los Adayes nevertheless continued to remain harsh. After the Treaty of Fontainebleau was signed in 1762, as a result of the end of the French and Indian War, the French ceded Louisiana to Spain. With Louisiana in Spanish control, there was no need for Los Adayes to reside so closely to Nacogdoches, especially after the missions were relocated to San Antonio. The Spanish monarchy commissioned Marquis de Robeline to inspect all the presidios on the northern frontier of New Spain and make recommendations for the future. Robeline recommended that eastern Texas be totally abandoned, with all of its population being moved to San Antonio. In August 1768, the acting governor of Texas, Juan Maria Vicencio, moved his headquarters and garrison to San Antonio, and in 1772, San Antonio became the new capital of Texas. The settlers who had lived near Los Adayes, which numbered at 500 people, on such short notice in June 1773, suddenly found themselves forced from their homes. The settlers were given only 5 days to prepare for the move to San Antonio. Many of them perished during the 3-month trek, and others died soon after arriving. Despite official instructions, however, the Adayesans did not resettle at San Antonio. Instead, they returned to East Texas, where, after their disappointing stay at Bucareli, a small Spanish settlement on the Trinity River, they established the permanent foundations for Nacogdoches. Los Adayes for some 50 years had endured and had maintained the Spanish presence in East Texas, and had been the first capital of Texas, holding that title for 41 years. The modern-day site of Los Adayes was declared a National Historic Landmark in 1986 and is now the Los Adayes State Historic Site near Robeline, Louisiana.